Welcome to What People Miss. Has success got you physically and mentally exhausted? Do you often belittle yourself in your mind while others applaud you and celebrate you? Have you lost self-respect? Find your mind crowded with shame and judgment? What I'm describing is emotional overwhelm. Welcome to What People Miss, a podcast. This podcast is your sacred space for your softness, your pleasure, your joy. You deserve a sacred home to practice pause and self-nurturing as a radical act, and to remember that you are allowed to choose joy and pleasure even in seasons of rage, transition, and grief. Listen for what you've been missing between the feelings and emotion you're dismissing. Get ready to take notes and meet my guest for today, Logina Mustafa.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to What People Miss.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
So, Logina and I have a very new relationship, and but a very, I would say, it's not even like a quick friendship. It seems like a very deep spiritual understanding. That's my impression. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that. I think that really resonates. When we first met, it felt like we were speaking the same language on multiple levels, and we're already on the same page. And so it's been really beautiful to explore different topics of conversation, especially with all of the layered context that we both have lived experience in. And I love our conversations, and talk for hours. So I'm so excited that we're doing this together now.
Yeah. So, for those of you who don't know, Logina is the creator of queering extensionalism. See, I can't even pronounce it correctly. And she has a master's in public health, and she's also a co-founder of the Violet Community. And I want to introduce you to my audience because you have such a interesting background. So could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing? Who are
Yes.
you? Where do you come from?
Okay, sure. So I was born in Alexandria, Egypt. Start at the beginning. Um, and I was so my family situation is unique because my mother's side is Coptic Orthodox Christian and my father's side is Muslim. And we immigrated to the States when I was about 4 years old. I grew up in New York City in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. Um, and then I moved to Iowa and I lived there for 10 years and I went, I became, yeah, that was a journey, a very educational journey. And then I moved back here. But yeah, I went to Egypt here and there, but there was a lot of conflict around my parents' religious differences, and then also being a very kind of stubborn, rebellious, kind of like feminist from a young age. My father and I definitely clashed in different ways. So, I felt like I wasn't so like understanding a sense of self across Egyptian culture, American culture, New York City, and Iowa, and it was definitely challenging, but an opportunity. And now I see the ways it can integrate and how it's expanded who I am. But that's a bit about my upbringing.
Wow. Okay. So I, having been born in Chicago and then growing up a little bit in Wisconsin and a little bit in Atlanta, um, I can resonate with the culture shock that you might have had early on. How many friends did you have when you lived in Iowa? No, I mean, not specifically, but just like, how was it to cultivate relationships in Iowa?
Hmm. Um, well, I, I started my journey there when I was like right my preteen, and so I think the era of that time is very important as well. But there was a lot of masking and a lot of kind of like wishing I was white or American or like my friends. Like I would straighten my hair every day. I didn't want to tan. I just really wanted to fit in, and I think that I was, and I still have a couple of friends from that time today. We actually have matching tattoos, these little
Aw.
hearts. Um, but yeah, like I found some refuge with a couple of folks, but yeah, the cultural differences were really hard, and I constantly felt like I was living a double life, if not a triple life. And it was hard not to internalize the differences between me and my friends and their families as a shortcoming, or like, I'm not allowed to do all these things. It's because I can't handle it, or I'm inferior then, instead of I'm dealing with a totally different cultural context. And a father telling me that you're not American, you're Egyptian, but then also not being around any Egyptian or Arab community because of my parents' religious differences. Yeah.
The reason why I asked about Iowa, and I'm glad that you also volunteered that you were a preteen, is because who we become is usually inspired, or it happens, like the catalyst happens around 11 years old. So, and so now, what are you doing? Let's fast forward to right now. Right now at 29, what's happening?
Oh, yes, the trajectory. So I currently live in Brooklyn, um, and um, I identify as a queer, non-monogamous, gender non-conforming woman who um, I work in, like, let's see, yeah, I work in an ethical tech startup. I work with the Brooklyn Psychedelics Society. I run different educational events around um, like sex positivity and integration and erotic power. I am the first woman in my family to go from to kind of be independent on my own for this amount of time. And yeah, it's I never thought that I would be here considering my upbringing, but yeah, I feel like I've healed codependency and a lot of generational trauma in terms of the ways that I relate to different people at different times. And um, yeah, that's a little bit about where I am today. But it's even just to like recount the story, it's still surprising to me because it feels like a completely different life rather than like a continuous thread.
Yeah, and it's only been what, 18 years, right? From that moment to now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, um, I'm hearing also heavily in your story that culture is kind of like an imprint. Was it ever more of a roadmap than an imprint?
Yes. Um, I think that for a long time, it was hard for me to tell the difference between cultural factors, generational factors, and factors relating to my own specific family dynamics. Um, and then I recently, I had a very healing experience earlier this year. I went to Egypt for the first time outside of familial context. And I had this deep moment of connecting with myself from another timeline where I didn't immigrate to the United States, and I just felt like I would have consistently been myself, regardless of that immigration and that shift, and realizing that a lot of things I thought weren't compatible with being Egyptian were actually the colonization of my own understanding of what it meant to be Egyptian. So doing a lot of this like ancient Egyptian ancestral work, understanding, um, what it means, like learning more about Isis, and just realizing I had to go further and further back ancestrally to realize there's this common thread that does connect to where I am today. Also realizing the way that I love now, which is um, my one of my friends, actually one of our dear friends who introduced us, recently told me that I was omni loving, and I was like, I love that. That's really resonates. Where there's this sense of like loving in a way that's closer to collectivism, living in the gift economy, or just letting like love flow so openly has actually been a return to my Egyptian identity, which I didn't expect. Because before that, especially this would happen more so in Iowa, right? People, I would just be like loving and caring the way that I was taught, the way that was more normalized, like in an Egyptian context, and people would be like, are you in love with me? Or like, or you did this because you were in love with me. And I was like, this is my baseline of care, and like showing up in this way. And then, yeah, so it has, and there's been like a reclamation that's been like happening over time in ways I didn't expect.
So, when you went to Egypt, was it your intention to find yourself, or you just were going because you're a world traveler?
Um, I I was going as a part of work, actually. It was interesting. Last November, I was part of a new moon ritual, an ancient Egyptian new moon ritual dedicated to the goddess Isis, and I was the one who was. There was like a point in time where it's like, will someone do a dance, for the goddess? And I was like, okay. Uh, and then, I was very much. I really believe in the power of attention and manifestation. Um, and I was longing for that like connection back around my sense of identity. And then I happened to be in February starting a new role, and then I through work was asked to go to Egypt to do some translation around different work and experiences relating to consciousness. So it was a really beautiful full circle moment, and I was just following the flow, and that's really been in the last year. A year ago, I left my 9 to 5 job in government, and I kind of started this journey of surrender after and kind of following the principles of existential kink, and it's brought a lot of beautiful, unexpected gifts into my life that I couldn't have like designed or planned for, versus earlier chapters where I was like grasping or wanting to have a lot of control, or was really wanting to plan things out. So um, that's how I ended up in Egypt.
That is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So, context is everything. And I have two questions around that. So, first of all, my last episode, I was talking about inner thirst and your fantasy world and your real life. So, you stopped living in a fantasy world, which is the matrix, right? You had that 9 to 5, and you started to live in the real world, which is this beautiful, what did you say? Kink,
Oh,
um,
existential kink.
existential kink. What is that?
Oh, so Existential Kink is a book. I'm not remembering the author's name exactly in this moment, um, but it talks about basically that it's about integrating shadow work, and that we came here to experience everything in the full spectrum of experiences. And if we radically accept that, like we're consenting to that, how empowering that is. And that was the first place where I read the definition of magic as the integration of body, mind, and spirit. And at the same time, I was reading You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, which is an internal family systems book. And I was like, oh, interesting. This is like the psychological like integration of all these parts. And then and this is also describing it as magic. And then that opened up following a lot of different threads that now impact like my rituals, my approach, and how I flow through the world. But yes.
Yeah. So now when you say that you have healed the codependency and some other generational habits that you've seen in your family, to go from what you have identified as codependency to non-monogamous, right? Like what was that journey like? Like completely different attachment styles we're talking.
Um, yes, absolutely. I sometimes I'm still, yeah, I'm very grateful to have made it to this version of reality in my own body. And I think that I will say that even within non-monogamy, there is at the beginning when okay, let me start from the beginning. So I struggled with codependency pretty severely. And understanding that there's not a value judgment around like different attachment styles or ways of operating, that these are all ingenious adaptation strategies that are used, we're utilizing to get our needs met when there is a lack of attunement and abundance.
Mhm.
I like that. And there was I was basically increasingly finding myself in situations when I was in different like love triangles, or I would have feelings for multiple people at the same time, and I had so much shame and judgment towards myself for that. I thought that something was wrong with me. I thought that I didn't love people fully, and I would kind of suppress these parts of myself. And eventually, I got to a point where I was deeply depressed and dissociated, and I said, my 20s are almost over. Let me give myself 6 months to do everything I told myself I wasn't allowed to do. I had a lot of fear that if I fully, that if I even tried out different things and liked them, that it would mean my family and I would stop talking. And I proceeded to, yeah, I intentionally stepped into non-monogamy just to experiment with it intentionally. It was like E&M. And then I found myself in a situation where I was deeply in love with someone who had been living in this way for a decade, and I had a choice. I either had to like address what was causing the deep panic in me and the beliefs that were um, like in, embodied that were making it really challenging for me to exist in that way, or lose that person. And I also realized that it was hard for me to go back because it felt like something I kept being called towards. And the hypocrisy that where I'm like, oh well, I'm attracted to different people and I appreciate connecting with different people, and but I'm really struggling when my partner is doing it. And it's like there's some like I need to reconcile that because that's not fair. And I threw I'm a gender woman sexuality studies like major from college, and I coped with the research, and I was like, okay, I have a really good understanding. Like, I read Polysecure and all the different books, and I was like,
Everybody does, yeah.
yes. And then I got into the politics of it too, and like how it connected to abolitionism and how it connected to freedom, and also at the very core how there was this hollow feeling where I didn't have a secure attachment to myself and I didn't know how to be alone. And this was creating dynamics where I was putting that onto other people. And
So hold on, let's pause with that. That is I love that. So say that again.
um, realizing that at the core was a lack of secure attachment to myself.
Yeah. And then you said that you were projecting that onto, you didn't use the word, but I'm going to insert the word. And would you agree that you were projecting that inadequacy onto others?
Absolutely. And a concept that really was transformative for me is actually from also the book on IFS, but it's the concept that we are our own primary caretakers, um, and other people are secondary caretakers. But when I started to realize that we're socialized through mononormativity or a set of beliefs around love to actually be codependent in order to separate us from our own sense of power, agency, and autonomy, especially as women, then I was like, oh, that's where these emotions are coming from. This is internalized systems of oppression within me. And that started to shift the attachments that I had as I like untangled all those threads.
Thank you for explaining that. I was hoping that that definition would come out. So I will definitely make sure that that will be a reel. um, I wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of women don't recognize that internal system of oppression through I must have one partner. My partner must not cheat on me. My partner must not love somebody else, right? And it becomes a thing of ownership, right? Or worthlessness, or whether or not you're worth something because you have a husband, not just a partner, right? Titles matter. That's part of it. And the attachment isn't really so much in the body as it is in the mind, because your body may be like, I hate this person. How many wives complain about their husbands, right? But they stay with him, right?
Mm.
And they could choose freely if they didn't have an internalized system of oppression. Maybe that's what are your thoughts on what I said?
I think I want to bring in the level of community into this conversation, because a lot of my work has centered on this concept of communal secure attachment as the environment in which like the optimal relational context can happen. By that I mean, for me, it was when I was in isolation or when I didn't have strong community where I could show up in a way authentic, where I was accepted, where there was, um, you know, the relational paradigm, which is very much like how can we work through this together, and just like a lot of compassion and authenticity around these identities I had had a lot of internalized shame around, or just even like what will help you with resources, will give you a place, because I was leaving, I, I was moving out of living with a partner, and at the same time I was my job, I was feeling like I couldn't do it anymore, I was so depressed, and I had been in that situation at other times in my life, but last year was the first time that I had a really good group. I had like multiple communities that I was a part of, and people who were willing to show up in a really meaningful way that helped me transition out of that period of time, where I didn't have to choose between attachment and authenticity. And I think there are very real financial components of this, right? And so I was in Brooklyn. There's a lot of like we're proximate to other people and we can build relationships in a different way. Um, and I think that changes everything, because I also, if we're not going to have community to hold us on the other side, or groups of people where we feel a sense of belonging, then it's much harder to leave those dynamics, or it's much harder to come to terms with what you've internalized and what you've lived with for so long, just to cope with um, the lack of options that you may have. So I grapple with this because I look at other folks or other times in my life, and I see this as like a really critical factor. And a lot of my work is driven by how can we expand the circle, how can we make this more, how can we be there to hold people on the other side, because otherwise it's much harder to cross it. And I had to go through my own period at different times of the void, I call it, where
Yeah.
I was making these changes and there was so much grief. I even if people were still in my life, there became this like emotional distance that happened. And I remember I would have these um, mushroom journeys where I'd be like falling through space and I'd see like my former identity and the ways I was so deeply connected to people in that reality, and I didn't want to let go. I didn't want to let go, and eventually I surrendered. Um, and I think ayahuasca really helped me with that as well, especially. I know I've gone many different directions, the generational piece, but I think how can we bring and this is where I think the public health lens applies to all of this too. Like, how can we bring in a really environmental lens of like, we're not existing in isolation. We have all the different circles. And instead of, how can we bring compassion to folks in different scenarios and look at like, what are the barriers to this outside of they're just attached to this idea?
Yeah. Thank you for naming that, and yeah, that community really matters. And the access to the types of communities that people need to bridge that gap from, leaving a situation and the grief, they need community to hold them in the transition and the grief, and to hold themselves, to have the tools within. And so, for myself, I would say, like, I didn't have, I would say, a community per se, but I did start out with being my own best caregiver. I say that I self nurtured myself out of my marriage.
Mm.
Um, So for, for 20 years, I was married. It wasn't, it was mostly very emotionally abusive, until it was physically abusive and other kinds of abusive. And I always started with, how can I be my own best lover? Like, how could can I show myself how I would love for my husband to love me? And I got busy with that, right? So I created like an internal community. And at that time, I would say I was a practicing Muslim. So I also drew on the spiritual side. But as you know, um, uh, the Muslim community, I would say the colonized Muslim community, doesn't really welcome divorce, even though it's totally um, recognized and halal to do that. And they kind of move away from accepting the possibility that there was abuse, and that it was inflicted by the husband. So that community option wasn't available to me. So what ended up happening, you went towards mushrooms and ayahuasca. I went towards spiritual sexuality, right? So I ended up in tantra and somatic sexology communities, and that became my community to augment my self nurturing. So there are, there are places out there where people can find themselves, uh, a community, and create community. And in both ways, even though we went different routes, we landed in positive sexuality, right? And sex positive spaces. So for me, that points to, at the core of what enlivens us as humans, right? And helps us to love ourselves and love freely, is to just welcome our sexuality in community, like the opposite way of what we're doing now. Recognize that it is that core of what makes us human.
Yes. And I definitely want to delve into that pathway with you. And before that, I want to highlight as well that um, I think a big part of like the connect, like that it's not an either or, it's both and more, as one of my dear friends likes to say, that I felt like when I was to zoom out a little bit, and I think about, when do we first learn how to relate to ourselves? How is that related to the first 5 years of life based on what we're surrounded with? And in doing all this inner child healing work, I think a lot of this is having corrective experiences with other people, but also having corrective experiences with ourselves as the self parent, as the one who's stepping in as the higher self in maybe ways we haven't seen modeled. And I found that when I started to experience these communities where there was secure attachment in the culture, um, it was a positive feedback loop where it was teaching me how to treat myself, because it was the inner community that was at the core of everything. And it was so foreign to me to be kind to myself. At a point in time, I would like pretend to write letters to my best friend from different perspectives to until it became more internalized, and it became the default state of being, or like my first instinct. So I want to highlight the ways that was like my way to like inner um, relating that shifted over time. And I think, yeah, I recently presented a workshop for Sex and Psychedelics magazine that was around decolonizing sexual liberation, that really went into the thorough line of erotic power, and how, whether it's psychedelics or sexuality or these different somatic pathways, that those tend to be the more stigmatized ones, but at the core, it's about embodiment, and connecting to that deep sense of like surrender, enthusiastic yes, what it means to be whole and integrated and connected to a sense of power that I think, when I has been intentionally, right, conditioned out of us, so to reclaim that and how powerful that is, and that it's creative life force energy at its core, that, and see, like that is part of sexuality, but Audre Lorde talks about like the pornification of erotic power. And so we can hold space for this pathway, but realize it's much deeper than that. So I would love to hear more about how erotic power has shown up in your life, and like how that connects to your pathway in these communities around sexuality and sacred sexuality.
Yeah, I would say, when I first experimented with it, I didn't know what I was doing, and I experienced I would call it spiritual injury. And I found a cure for that immediately, because in my body, it's like I was aware of what was happening. And it's like I was calling for the healing, I was calling for like another mentor or something. And so through that, I discovered CAP, which is Kundalini activation process, right? Which really works directly with that sexual erotic energy in the body, but to connect as a frequency with all that is, and so that was something that shifted my perception of what erotic power is, what sexual energy is, and how to be with it. And that's where the layers of like shame and judgment, inner shame and inner judgment around my choices started to fall. And then I opened myself up to more experiences and connecting with more people openly, and joining like different communities where I could just be free. And that's kind of how we met, right? And you can have the real conversations, and no false connections, and actually seeing each other's souls. So that's been my experience with um, exploring my erotic power. And a lot of times, people expect me to say, oh, I've got 15 lovers and I do this, and no, that's not what it is for me. It's like, it's not about the numbers, it's about the deep spiritual connection. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting to reflect on. There's a book that really changed my life around healing the fragmented selves of trauma survivors by Dr. Janina Fisher. It's a neurobiology of trauma book, and talks about like there's another thread of healing as like integrating the self and like unity within the self, and then how that ripples out. Like I believe that is a critical part of liberation work, because if systems of oppression benefit from divisiveness on every level, that starts at the intrapersonal level. And so if we look at the things that we're taught to stigmatize the most, or where there's like the greatest sense of punishment or shame. I remember like my mom found me watching porn one time when I was a little kid, and then she was like, don't talk about this, or don't do this again. We never have to talk about it. And I just remembered, okay, I have to do this in secrecy, especially as a girl, to like suppress this. This is bad. And so that part gets, the idea of the self concept of the self schisming is like, I can still stay good if this part isn't me. So I'm going to push it away. And so I think on my journey, on my healing journey, and also my liberation journey, because I've been also thinking about the goal isn't healing. What am I going to do at that point forward? What am I creating? I think that when we integrate and call in these parts of ourselves that are related to sexuality and our erotic power that have been especially exiled from a young age, there's something very powerful about that, about calling pieces of ourself back, and having a seat at the table for them. And then I think it's really interesting how this can, I love what you said about being with the frequency of all that is. And like also I think another what books a lot, the mind magic, the neuroscience of magic, and manifestation, talks about literally how different parts of the brain, when they are in greater cohesion, in coherence, like how that impacts our perception of reality, clarity around what we want and what it means to be at home within ourselves, and how we live in a culture that deeply benefits, from that schisming. So we're always constantly reaching out, right? Whether that, so now we're getting into capitalism and the colonialism of it all. But I think it's been deeply empowering to realize, like, I like weed through my beliefs and how I'm moving through the world, and how I'm like, oh, who benefits from this shame or this concept? Where did this come from? And then being like, oh, um, I am going to weed this out and not just focus on what I don't want in my psyche or my state of being, but like got my yes tattoo, like what I do want to cultivate. And um, I think it's interesting too, like, it's like, is it um, the chicken or the egg? Because I think that when we start to cultivate that energy internally, it shifts who we attract into our lives and the opportunities that we
Yes.
attract. I've experienced that with such ease, and I've been in awe about that process as well.
Yeah, I totally would say that because like on this journey, it's like at first, like for the first 3 years out of my marriage, I wasn't trying to talk to anybody about anything, like even though I was learning Tantra and learning, things. Then I was like, you know what? Let me just see where I am inside. Let's see who comes, right? And then I saw, haven't gone very far from my husband, you know? And so then I was like, okay, well, that was good. We have a pretty good baseline barometer where we are. And then, I go back, do more integration, do more work, not judge myself for that experiment, right? And then again, okay, let's see who comes, right? And so as I've been going through this process, like closer to who I actually desire to be in my life is coming, right? And so now I feel like it's to a point where it's easier for me to attract um, more of who I actually want to be around, the more compassionate energies. So I want to put a pin in it because, I want to do this as a series with you. So I think this is a good foundation to see like who you are, what's your journey been, and like where our discussion's going. I do want to dive in more and further discussions with you about the goddess Isis, and then also some other indigenous spiritual uh, practices that are matriarchal centered. So
Sounds wonderful. Yay.
excellent. We shall continue. But for now, thank you for being here for part one.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What People Miss. I invite you to take the ideas and values that you heard today and go from surviving into savoring and rewiring your life for emotional freedom. My further invitation is to visit my website, cordeliagaffar.com, and find out all the things I have to offer to support you in your journey to choose joy and pleasure. Until next week, savor your life.